Oh ho ho! Hey everybody! It's time to talk about Apple. We're going to bring a 2015 MacBook Air back from the grave and install Linux on it. Because Apple may not have abandoned it yet, but I have a friend who really needs this computer to work, doesn't want to spend the money to fix it, and wants it to keep working when Apple deprecates macOS Monterey. First off, some background. The 2015 MacBook Air was released at the beginning of 2015.
You can download the Unreal Engine for Mac right now, and the Fortnite beta for Mac starts this fall.
Ah, yes. The days when Epic Games bragged about having their games on Apple devices. And as time went on, the MacBook Air, in particular of this design, has become incredibly popular, especially with the younger kids, and becoming one of the most sought after Apple computers, especially with the advent of the new Apple Silicon chips. But my particular model doesn't have the Apple Silicon chips, and it's definitely seen some wear and tear over the years. Despite these physical issues, the computer's still very much usable, provided you make some, let's say, compromises. First, the down arrow key is missing, but if you press the little nub, it works just fine. The hinge on the computer has seen some wear and tear over the years. Like if you jerk the computer the wrong way or when you carry the computer, you're gonna really feel that screen snap back and forth. Oh, and this previous model used to have lots of masking tape on it and big letters saying, please do not unplug this laptop. And you're wondering, why does it say that? Well, it's because if you actually examine this computer very carefully, you can see that the battery is bulging out of the case, a sign of battery aging. In fact, it's bulging out of the case so hard that the Mac's casing is damaged. And if anyone doesn't know, if your computer's battery or if your phone's battery or any kind of lithium-ion rechargeable battery is bulging like this, that usually means that your battery is a fire hazard and it's probably going to burn at any moment. So that means I'm actually going to have to get one of those proprietary Apple screwdrivers, remove the case, and remove the battery, because it's not like you can go buy replacement parts online because Apple doesn't believe in your right to repair. I mean, granted, because my friend's pretty much a boomer, they're going to treat this like a desktop computer anyway. As of time of recording, I've tried to install as many Apple updates as I can, and this particular Apple model runs macOS Monterey, except the problem is macOS Monterey is the last version of macOS this thing can run. It's not on the list of devices that are supported by macOS Ventura. In fact, this computer is on death row. Apple is going to kill off macOS Monterey any day now, especially since Monterey is 2 releases behind the current macOS Ventura, and WWDC is going to happen in June, where Apple's going to use its time to announce the annual release and the new version of macOS, probably named after a location in California. But enough talk about this device. Let's get into it, because that's not why you clicked on this video. You're here to find out how to run a 2015 MacBook in the Lord's year of 2023. So let's install some Linux. There are some problems, and now let's talk about some of those problems right now. The first is the fact that this is Apple hardware. This is going to be an uphill battle, and we're going to be fighting with Apple killing off all support for this device. In fact, Apple actually makes it more difficult for you to install unsigned versions of macOS and repeatedly unsigned versions of macOS as they get phased out. Apple hardware is also incredibly finicky because they also use custom Broadcom chips. Now, back in the day, Broadcom on Linux used to be pretty bad, and Broadcom has had a rocky relationship on Linux, especially if you use a distro which only supports free and open source software, specifically distros like Debian, Fedora, openSUSE. It has a ton of problems. But as time has gone on, Broadcom has actually been a lot more stable on Linux than it used to be in the past. The Broadcom chips that are manufactured for Apple computers are specially designed for Apple hardware. For example, you will not be able to get the webcam on this computer to work on Linux. Now, you might think you could use the RecoveryOS after you've uninstalled macOS and have installed Linux, but you can't. The problem with the RecoveryOS is tied to macOS, and that's going to remove our ability to customize portions of Apple hardware. But not only is it tied to the drive, it's also tied to you using macOS, and yes, the recovery system is saved to a partition on that drive. So before you make changes to your computer, you better be sure that you made every change to your Apple hardware before you've made your switch over to Linux. This is why I believe, because this device is no longer seeing support from Apple, any possible security measures that you can take on this device are completely off the table, because our access is going to be cut off from all Apple things. And if this device is wiped or corrupted somehow, we need to disable those pesky Apple security features so that we can do stuff on it by installing Linux. And we need to do this in such a way that when we remove these systems, we're prepared and it's all set up so that it won't interfere with Linux, and then we can only run Linux. And I understand that for some people it's a shocker saying that this is a security trade-off, but I think this thing is long past its security trade-off, given it's been 8 years now. So here's what we're going to need to do first. And what I'm going to recommend is we're going to need to boot into recovery on macOS. You can access recovery by pressing Command R when you hear the classic Apple boot up chime, unless you've disabled it. And since Apple has abandoned us, disabling system integrity protection is necessary for us to minimize the interference from what Apple can do while we are running Linux. And yes, believe it or not, you still need to do this because there are all sorts of special proprietary software and hardware protections inside of the MacBook, which will tamper with what we are doing, and they're going to severely interfere with how Linux functions. If you're going to be testing drivers, you want to disable system integrity protection so that you know it works with the base hardware and macOS system. Oh, we're testing drivers, all right. We just happen to be testing some drivers and destroying macOS and replacing it with a custom operating system. So if you go into recovery, go into utilities, then go into terminal, and then in terminal you want to type in CSR util disable. And doing so will disable system integrity protection once you reboot. Oh, and also while we're here, we're going to want to disable the firmware password. There's not going to be a way to configure the firmware password in macOS, especially once we've removed it, or we can't reinstall macOS. And it's going to become progressively harder because the operating system is going to be unsigned, and we're not going to be able to get a signed version of macOS on here, at least easily. As a failsafe, before you do anything, this is the time where you would install something like your custom macOS bootloader or whatever, but I'm not even going to be covering that here. I'm sure some of you are smart enough to figure that out on your own. But this is also where you need to have a USB drive of the previous version of macOS. In my case, this is macOS Monterey, and this should be the latest version of macOS that your device can support. And if you follow the instructions from Apple's website, they actually have a guide explaining how to install older versions of macOS from the App Store, and you can actually distribute those on a USB drive in case something goes wrong with your Mac or if we flub the installation process somehow. So for the time being, I'm going to keep with me a macOS Monterey USB drive. Now, I know there's going to be a small subset of people who's going to be like, I'm going to bust out my 128GB Ventoy USB drive with all of my favorite Windows versions and Linux distributions on it. So let's go install it using Ventoy, except you can't. The problem with Ventoy is fundamentally incompatible with Apple hardware and doesn't work at all. Yes, even if you disable system integrity protection or the firmware password, it will not work. So you're going to have to do this the old-fashioned way, burning just one operating system at a time to a USB drive. Now that all of that's out of the way, we've deleted all of those pesky Apple security mechanisms. Now what do? We need to figure out what distro we want to install. I first tried Fedora 37, my classic go-to desktop Linux distribution. Out of the box, the Wi-Fi doesn't work, but that's totally fine. I know a bunch of other devices with Broadcom are supported on Fedora, so I wasn't worried about that. But something that I didn't think would work was if you close the lid of the laptop, or if you just put it to sleep in the settings, the computer will wake right back up. And if you look on a lot of guides online, you'll find that a lot of people have been incredibly frustrated with the interaction that Linux has with Apple computers going to sleep. But what's even more interesting to me is that even though the computer will wake back up if you put it to sleep, the Fedora 37 installer will fail and not proceed. In my mind, this is completely unacceptable. And I did some research because I was like, why is it doing this? But it turns out something has actually been going on since the beginning of Fedora 37, and it's because of the way Grub handles booting. So when it encounters the macOS firmware, it won't let you boot. And as a result, you need to create a custom boot entry every time Grub receives an update to fix it. And yes, I know I could make some cron job to fix the whole thing, but I'm not going to do that. There's no way my friend is going to keep up with that. And if Grub changes sometime in the future, they're not going to have a bootable system. So Fedora doesn't really work, and that bums me out because Fedora is the #1 desktop that I recommend to people. But then I turned to my second. My second choice was openSUSE, and openSUSE Tumbleweed, not openSUSE Leap because we want to be using a rolling release distribution, and openSUSE Tumbleweed because it's newer, will support newer types of hardware. Now, while it did take a million years, openSUSE did eventually install, and my experience at first was actually really good. For example, the Wi-Fi drivers work as long as you install Pacman from openSUSE's wiki. And once you install the Broadcom drivers from Pacman, Broadcom Wi-Fi drivers actually work really great. But there's one problem, and it's arguably a big problem actually, because the system works fine, lots of programs work great on it, but the computer will not wake up if you close the lid of the computer. And I said, well, this isn't good. Well, but at least it's better than Fedora because you can install it and it works, right? But it's going to incredibly confuse someone if they close the lid on their computer and their computer just presents them a black screen. So this is also not really an option. Now, I also want to point this out because I can't wait for someone in the comments to tell me, well, you've exhausted 2 options like most people should be using. Why don't you try Arch Linux? And I am sure that Arch Linux probably works, but I am not giving Arch to my normie friend. But you don't want to hear what doesn't work, so what does work? And I know this might come as a shock to people, and I was definitely dragged kicking and screaming into this reality, but I found out that my best option was Ubuntu. The Ubiquity installer identified all of my drivers and installed everything automatically. And no, this is not the new Ubuntu 2304 Lunar Lobster installer written in Flutter, because I feel it's irresponsible giving someone who doesn't know what they're doing the interim release rather than the long-term release. Now, I don't think that's exactly optimal because I believe you should be updating in between that time, like when Canonical pushes an update every 3 or 5 years, but it's still way better because that means we can get as much life out of this computer as we can. And you could say, well, they update GNOME, but it's not like they're gonna update things like the stupid little games they pre-install or LibreOffice or whatever. So what's the point of the interim release? Just use the LTS because that's what Ubuntu and Canonical build for anyway. But don't get me wrong, Ubuntu actually seems to have a lot of polish around the Mac and actually works really well on Apple hardware. And in my experience testing out programs on it, everything seems to be really, really great. And I was actually really impressed that everything got up and running. You can close the lid and it will wake up correctly. Apt and installing Flatpaks and snaps work correctly. And I'm just going to give this to my friend and it's going to work great. And let's also go over some final touches. And I'm not going to get into deep detail about this because here's some of the things that I do on a base Ubuntu install. And maybe you can take this and use this if you're an Ubuntu user yourself. So the first thing I did was disable Ubuntu's annoying telemetry. I'm pretty sure my friend wouldn't like their IP address and time zone scraped by Ubuntu and sent to Canonical HQ every day. I mean, I'm pretty sure they didn't like it when Apple did it all the time. And I also configured Update Manager to make sure that all of their apps, so like their apt, snap, and Flatpak packages update automatically and constantly receive a steady stream of security updates. And you're like, Flatpak? You got Flatpak on here? Well, I also installed the GNOME software store, and specifically GNOME software with the Flatpak extension. So that way they can go to GNOME software and I can condition them to go to GNOME software and download everything as their snap, apt, and Flatpak packages. But as we all know, GNOME defaults to Flatpak, and I would like to steer them in the direction of install everything as a Flatpak, because that is the direction we want to be moving in, because Flatpaks are the future of packaging applications on Linux without having to think about the underlying Linux distribution. And if they really have trouble, then they can go back to installing the apt or snap packages. And I know there's going to be some diehard people out there who are going to be like, I hate snaps. Snaps are the devil. Canonical is evil. You should do what Linux Mint did and get rid of them, but I don't agree with that. In fact, I would actually strongly recommend not removing snaps from Ubuntu. Now, hear me out. If this is for some sort of ideological crusade or whatever, snaps are sanctioned by Canonical, and Ubuntu is maintained by Canonical. If you don't trust Canonical, why are you using a Canonical operating system? It doesn't make any sense. But the other problem is snaps are still superior to native packages, even though it might be annoying and cumbersome to those power users, because I know that the snaps are going to auto-update, and I know because of Ubuntu's support for it, they're going to at least have some sort of auditable degree of sandboxing, which is still better than running them as apt packages where there's no sandboxing at all. And I also dropped in a few other bonuses too. And I installed the Brave browser on them. I just configured the Brave browser and removed all the crypto garbage. And I just told them, oh, click on this little lion. It's like Google Chrome, except a little better. And they were like, oh, okay. Look, it even blocks those cookie banners and YouTube ads. And they were like, wow, that's amazing. And I also installed OnlyOffice and VLC. So that way they can view documents and video files that people send them, because we need to have both of these things. And lastly, because it's just a little feature, I configured AppArmor. AppArmor, and in setting every major profile into enforce mode, is so easy. You can get it done super quickly, so just do it, okay? It's literally free, it only takes a few seconds, and has zero interference on your base system. And hopefully, you can use this as a building block to install Linux on your Apple hardware, because I'm sure there's going to be some people who are going to be like, I want to install Arch Linux on my Apple hardware. And I say, great. All you have to do is let me know about your experience in the comments down below. But hey, you made it this far in the video. Why don't you go like the video? Like this video. If you remember macOS El Capitan. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to leave me an email, why don't you go leave me an email at my email address, or send me a message on one of my social media platforms. Links are in the description down below. Thanks for watching. I will see you guys later. Have a great rest of your week.